Okay, hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to explain about the fermentation. And please bear with me because there will be some sound in the background because my kid is with me right now. So let me share the screen first to show you the PowerPoint. Okay, so in this video, we're going to learn about fermentation. As I said, fermentation is under the subtopic of cellular respirations. Okay, so bear in mind we already learned about cellular respiration, and cellular respiration is divided into two, which is aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. So what is fermentation? Before that, you need to know that fermentation is under category of anaerobic respiration. Okay, anaerobic respiration. Okay, because as you have already learned, anaerobic respiration is respiration that doesn't need oxygen. Okay, it happens without the it happens in absence of oxygen. Anaerobic. Okay, so one examples of anaerobic respiration is fermentation. Okay, fermentation. Okay, so here I think I'm gonna draw a little bit. Okay, so this is I cannot draw. There's a problem with my screen, so I cannot draw. Okay, I think I'm gonna go back with the highlight. Okay, so fermentation means that the glucose breakdown. We know that respiration is a glucose breakdown, but in this case, fermentation is a glucose breakdown is incomplete. Why is that so? Because oxygen is limited or absent. Okay, since there is no oxygen, so the glucose breakdown will be incomplete. Okay, and as you know, in cellular respiration, there are two pathways for aerobic, right? For aerobic respiration. The first pathway is where the glucose is breakdown. The glucose breakdown become pyruvate. Okay, it become pyruvate. Then the second pathway, before that, this glucose breakdown into pyruvate. Pyruvate, it happens in cytoplasm. And then this pyruvate will go to the mitochondria, and this pyruvate will oxidize by oxygen to produce energy, carbon dioxide and water. So that will have been discussed in the previous session. Okay, so what happened in fermentation? There's still a glucose breakdown, meaning that there's still a breakdown of glucose to become pyruvate. But since there is no oxygen, so there is no point this pyruvate go to the mitochondria and become oxidized because there is no oxygen. Then what happened to this pyruvate? This pyruvate will undergo alcohol fermentation or lactic acid fermentation. Okay, yes, the term for the glucose breakdown is glycolysis. I almost forgot that. Okay, now what is alcohol fermentation and acid lactic fermentation? We go to one by one. Alcohol fermentation. Okay, so alcohol fermentation is when the incomplete of breakdown and then it produces ethanol, carbon dioxide and energy. Okay, you can see there energy is still being produced in this fermentation, but the value is low. compared to aerobic respiration. Okay, why we call it alcohol fermentation? Because when this fermentation happen, alcohol is being produced, is being synthesized. So what kind of alcohol? What term of alcohol? It's ethanol. Ethanol. Okay, anything that ends with ol, can be it can describe as alcohol. So you can see here when alcohol is undergo glycolysis and then it goes to the alcohol fermentation, it will produce ethanol, carbon dioxide, and energy. There are two types of there are two examples that it wants to show you the alcohol fermentation. First, it happens in yeast. Yeast will undergo alcohol fermentation. Okay, so this alcohol or ethanol that been produced in alcohol fermentation is used in the making of beer and wine. Okay, so you know now that beer and wine is ethanol. It was made from a process of fermentation. And then the second one, the released carbon dioxide in yeast, okay, yeast, it undergo the alcohol fermentation, and you can see during the alcohol fermentation, it produces ethanol. That's for making beer and wine, and for making dough, for making bread, okay, actually the carbon dioxide from the alcohol fermentation makes the dough rise. Okay, so itu dia boleh naik rise. Kalau kamu buat dough, even you make a cake, you use a yeast. Whenever usually we make a bread using a yeast. Why we use yeast? To make the bread go puff, bigger in size, and it's fluffy. It because the yeast itself release carbon dioxide. So actually, the rise of the bread comes from the carbon dioxide. Okay, so second example of alcohol fermentation, it happens in plants. Okay, the for example is paddy plants. Pokok padi lah, tumbuhan padi. Paddy plants grow in waterlogged areas. Waterlogged areas means yang kawasan yang berair, waterlogged areas. So when there's waterlogged areas, there is a less oxygen. Okay, less oxygen. So this plant will carry out alcohol fermentation. Okay, as you know that plants also carry out cellular respiration. What kind of cellular respiration? So if this plant is if the plants in this situation, like in waterlogged area, this plant will do will carry out alcohol fermentation. Okay, so ethanol, you know, alcohol fermentation will produce again, it will produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. So ethanol that been produced during the fermentation is toxic for most plants. Okay, however, the cell of the paddy plants have a higher tolerance. Dia boleh tahan. Sebab apa? Why is that paddy plants is higher tolerance? Because paddy plants, it has an enzyme. What kind of enzyme? It has an alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme. What this enzyme do? This enzyme break down the ethanol. Okay, that ethanol itself is toxic to most plants, but this paddy plants has a special alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme. Because of this enzyme, it will break down the ethanols from toxic become non-toxic carbon dioxide. Okay, even the situation where there's a flood, banjir kan untuk beberapa hari, this plant will carry out the alcohol fermentation. Okay, so again, for you, easy to remember, what is alcohol fermentation? Remember the product. From alcohol, it will produce ethanol, and of course carbon dioxide, and of course energy, because this is the point of cellular respiration. The cellular respiration is to produce energy. Okay, so next one, the second alcohol, this not the second alcohol, sorry. The second fermentation is lactic acid fermentation. Okay, remember the name. The name represents the product. Okay, so in the lactic fermentation, what is the product? The product is, of course, lactic acid. Okay, so this is much simpler compared to the previous one, compared to the alcohol fermentation. This lactic acid fermentation is much simpler, because from glucose it will produce lactic acid and energy. Okay, lactic acid and energy. Okay, so there are two examples of cells or organism that carry out this lactic acid fermentation. The first one is lactobacillus. Okay, lactobacillus is a bacteria, and the second one is us, our muscle cell, human muscle cell. We're gonna look at it much deeper later on. We focus in this lactobacillus first. Okay, lactobacillus is a bacteria that can be found in our yogurt, in our drink, apa ni, Yakult semacam tu kan. It has a lactobacillus bacteria. Okay, this lactobacillus bacteria, lactobacillus, it carries out milk fermentation. Okay, milk fermentation, which is actually a lactic acid fermentation. Okay, then it produces yogurt. Okay, so when this lactobacillus carry out milk fermentation to produce a yogurt, actually this bacteria, you know, milk contain lactose. It's a milk sugar. Milk sugar contain lactose, and this bacteria of lactobacillus acts on lactose. So lactose means sugar, milk sugar. So it turns the milk sugar into lactic acid. Okay, this lactic acid will coagulate. Coagulate means it turns into solid or semi-liquid. You know, milk is a liquid, cair. When the lactic acid coagulate mean that this milk, which is liquid, will turn into a semi-liquid. Okay, dia macam tidak cair, dia semi-liquid, separuh cecair. Okay, to produce yogurt. If you know the texture of the yogurt, that is semi-fluid. Okay, and why yogurt is so sour in taste? Kenapa masam? Because the lactic acid. You know, acid kan masam. So why it has a sour taste? Yogurt, okay, in yogurt, because it's a lactic acid. Now you can tell your family or your parents, well, I know why yogurt is sour, masam, because it's lactic acid. Why? What is lactic acid? Why, you know, you can tell your family, you can share this story with your family. Well, you know, actually, there's a bacteria, it's been used to produce this yogurt. Okay, bacteria, it's been put in milk, and then this bacteria, which is lactobacillus, react with this lactose. What is lactose? Lactose, well, lactose is a milk sugar. It's a type of sugar that can be found in milk. And then it will coagulate. Okay, coagulate. And turn this milk into yogurt. So this yogurt has a sour taste because this glucose or this lactose is undergo fermentation. During the fermentation, the lactic acid and energy has been produced. Okay, so that is the story about lactobacillus. Now we go to the human cell. Bear in mind, human cell, okay, not human cell, sorry, human muscle cell. We must emphasize the muscle cell because this lactic acid fermentation happen in our muscle cell. Okay, mari kita pergi zoom in. Okay, muscle cell. Alright. Actually, it starts with a normal aerobic respiration. Okay, for normal aerobic respiration, itu teacher suka tulis, tapi ini macam susah, teacher tidak boleh tulis. I hope you can listen my word. Okay, be careful. Listen carefully. Be careful pula. Listen carefully. Okay. So, muscle cell, this muscle cell carry out aerobic respiration. Kalau aerobic meaning it use oxygen. Okay, use oxygen. Kenapa kita buat aerobic respiration? To produce energy. Okay, so normally when we do activity, contohnya kita starting untuk jogging. Jogging kita akan slow jalan dulu kan. So kita akan nafas biasa dulu. Okay, we breathe normally. Okay, tapi makin lama kita cuba laju. We to speed up our run. Okay, so it becomes a vigorous. Vigorous ni is involved in physical strength. Makin laju kan, kita makin laju lari. Vigorous training. So did you notice that your tempo of breathing is changing? It's become more faster. Okay, because you need more oxygen. Why you need more oxygen? Okay, so you need more oxygen to oxidize more glucose. Okay, we need more oxygen to oxidize more glucose. Tapi there's a moment where during vigorous training, the active movement, the rate of oxygen used exceeds the oxygen supplied by the blood circulatory system. Maksudnya, yang supply sedikit tapi kita guna banyak. Okay, so there's a moment where the muscle is in oxygen deficiency state. Maksudnya kurang. Deficiency ni maksudnya kurang. Less oxygen. So remember when we said about less oxygen, it falls to the anaerobic respiration category. Boleh faham? Mula-mula tadi, we just slowly walk. Starting kan, kita slowly jalan macam biasa. Dia masih lagi under aerobic. Sebab kita normally guna oxygen untuk oxidize, to produce more energy, sebab kita mau bergerak. Tapi makin kita laju, oxygen kurang sebab cannot catch up. The oxygen cannot catch up. Cannot catch up ni, inilah. Maksudnya, the rate of oxygen used is exceed the oxygen supply. Kita perlu banyak tapi yang supply sedikit saja. Tapi so how this muscle catch up? Macam mana dia mau produce energy kalau tiada oxygen? So that is when this muscle cell do the lactic acid fermentation. Okay. So before that, you need to understand the situation dulu. Dia mesti jadi situasi ni, which is oxygen depth. Hutang oxygen depth. Meaning that dia ada hutang. Dia perlu, maksudnya dia perlu, let's make it a value. Contohnya lah, oksigen dia perlu 10. Tapi yang perlu, yang kena supply hanya 5. So, dia ada hutang lagi 5. Okay. So, di mana dia mau cover up this lagi 5 ni? That is when the muscle cell atau our human muscle cell do the lactic acid fermentation. Sebab lactic acid fermentation tidak perlukan oksigen. Okay. So, during this process, glucose cannot break down completely. Whenever tiada oksigen saja, we can call it as glucose breakdown incompletely. For each glucose molecule that is broken down, only 2 ATP molecules or 150 kilojoule energy will be produced. Okay, I just want to show you there's only little amount of energy will be produced while the muscle cells during the lactic acid fermentation in our muscle cell. Hanya sedikit sahaja. Tapi there's still energy, cuma sedikit. Okay. Then, tadi kita sudah tengok in the previous one, glucose kalau under lactic fermentation, dia akan hasilkan lactic acid energy. So, kita tahu tadi energy being produced tapi sedikit. And then there's lactic acid. So, this lactic acid will accumulate until it reach a level of concentration that can cause fatigue and muscle cramp. Kalau kamu perasan, whenever you run atau kamu buat aktiviti yang sangat cergas, sangat memenatkan. Istilah penat itself, fatigue. Okay? Pernah kamu rasa lari-lari, kaki kamu sakit, lemah, macam tu kan, cramp. Sakit kaki lah, sakit kaki yang kejang, macam tu. Sebab apa? Because the lactic acid. Okay, itu adalah lactic acid. Tapi kamu perasan tidak, after sometimes, rasa lengu-lengu bila kamu rehat, when you take a rest, and then the fatigue itself, the muscle cramp itself, gone, hilang. Kenapa? Okay. Once the vigorous activity stops, the intake of excess oxygen will oxidize the lactic acid into carbon dioxide, water, and energy. When all the lactic acid has been expelled, the oxygen is repaid. Kena bayar. Tadi ada hutang oksigen kan? Kena bayar sudah. Okay. So di sini maksudnya, kenapa tadi I give you the example that whenever you do an activity, let's say you run as fast as you can and then you feel pain in your muscle, in your leg, rasa sakit, penat. Di kaki tu ada rasa sakit, lengu-lengu sakit kan, especially di bahagian betis ni. Tapi bila kamu rehat, you take some time and the pain will be gone. Sebab kamu ada masa untuk breathe normal again, baru dapat ambil lagi oksigen. The oxygen help to oxidize the lactic acid. Okay? Alright. So next, let's compare between this aerobic respiration and fermentation. AKA fermentation, AKA you can have in mind this is anaerobic fermentation. Anaerobic respiration. Okay? So when we say compare, bila soalan minta kamu compare, when the question asks you to compare, meaning that you have to find, you have to state the similarities and the differences. Okay, always start with the similarities. So similarities between aerobic respiration and fermentation is both involve the breakdown process of glucose. Of course, it must start with glucose and its conversion to chemical energy. Okay, next, The process begins in the cytoplasm. Okay. And the third one occurs in yeast, bacteria, animals, and plants. Alright. And the fourth one produce chemical energy in the form of ATP. And the last one, the similarity of between aerobic respiration and fermentation is the process begins with glycolysis. Yes, when glucose is converted to pyruvate. Maksudnya starting sama. Dua-dua akan either it's aerobic respiration or fermentation. It's always start with glycolysis. Dia akan pecah dulu glucose breakdown into pyruvate. But ending dia berbeza. Ending dia yang define dia mana satu yang aerobic, mana satu yang fermentation. Okay, because untuk aerobic respiration, now we go to the differences. Okay, this is in terms of oxygen. Okay, for aerobic respiration, the breakdown process of glucose is complete because in the presence of oxygen. Fermentation, senang je ambil ayat dia ni, tapi kamu tambah saja, change dia kan. The breakdown process of glucose is incomplete without oxygen or limited oxygen condition. Alright, so this is where it takes place. For aerobic respiration, it occurs in cytoplasm and mitochondria. Mitochondrion as a singular. Okay, fermentation pula, it occurs in cytoplasm only. Okay, the third one is about water. Aerobic respiration is produce water and fermentation does not produce water. Okay, the fourth one, as you can relate that when it is oxidized completely, when the glucose is oxidized completely, it will produce or it will oxidize into carbon dioxide and water. While for fermentation, since glucose is not oxidized completely, it will oxidize, not completely oxidized, oxidized completely into ethanol and carbon dioxide. Okay, ethanol and carbon dioxide. This is for alcohol fermentation, or this glucose will become lactic acid in lactic acid fermentation. Okay, the last differences is one molecule of glucose can generate 2,898 kilojoule. Kilojoule is a unit for energy. Okay. While for fermentation, one alcohol of glucose generates 210 kilojoule in alcoholic fermentation, while 150 kilojoule in lactic acid fermentation. Okay, so that's all. I hope you can it helps you to learn, atau it helps you to understand the topic. It's more like listening to the radio actually. I'm actually prefer to write down or just do a sketch a little bit here and there in my slide, but because of this problem with my laptop screen, I cannot do that. So I hope my explanation today helps you to understand today's topic, and I hope that if there's any question that you don't understand about this topic, you may ask me in the WhatsApp. Alright, so that's all the video for fermentation. Thank you very much.